From New York, this is Democracy Now!
This vote, I'm ashamed to say, is further evidence that voter suppression has become part of the official platform of the Republican Party.
Senate Republicans have used the filibuster to block debate on the most sweeping voting rights bill considered by Congress in decades. We'll look at the For the People Act and the fight over the filibuster with the Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign and Elizabeth Hira of the Brennan Center for Justice.
The For the People Act is America's next great civil rights bill, an opportunity to transform our American democracy by changing how we draw congressional districts, protecting the right of every voter to vote, and changing, through campaign finance reform, who gets a seat at the table to actually run and represent everyday Americans, lifting up the policies that matter to all of us.
Then the White House says it'll miss its goal of hitting 70% of adults at least partially vaccinated by July 4th, alarming public health officials as the COVID Delta variant rapidly spreads.
We are not done until we completely crush this outbreak. The Delta variant is currently the greatest threat in the U.S. to our attempt to eliminate COVID-19. Good news, our vaccines are effective against the Delta variant. Conclusion, we have the tools, so let's use them and crush the outbreak.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senate Republicans blocked the sweeping voter protection bill For the People Act from advancing Tuesday in a major but expected blow to Democrats and to voting rights. The move comes amidst a crackdown on voting rights in Republican-led states and as calls mount to abolish the filibuster so Democrats can circumvent Republican stonewalling. Vice President Kamala Harris spoke after the vote.
This is about the American people's right to vote, unfettered. It is about their access to the right to vote in a meaningful way. Because nobody is debating, I don't believe, whether all Americans have the right to vote. The issue here is there actual access to the voting process, or is that being impeded? President
Biden and Democrats have vowed to keep fighting to protect voting rights at the federal level. We'll have more on this story after headlines. In Ethiopia, Reuters reports dozens of people have been killed after an airstrike in the Tigray region. A bomb was reportedly dropped on a market Tuesday afternoon. Health workers are reporting Ethiopian military blocked several ambulances from reaching the scene. Thousands of people have been killed in the Tigray region since the Ethiopian military invaded last November with support from Eritrea. There have also been widespread reports of war crimes, including sexual violence. Aid groups warn millions in the region are at risk of famine. Japan has restarted its first nuclear reactor in over 3 years, despite major concerns over its safety and widespread public opposition to Japan's continued use of nuclear power. Energy experts say the government is not heeding the lessons of the devastating triple disaster of 2011, which killed nearly 20,000 people after a 9.0 magnitude earthquake triggered a tsunami and a nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima power plant. Some residents still remain displaced 10 years later. The UN and other rights groups are condemning the government of Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega over its mounting crackdown on opposition ahead of the November election. At least 15 people have been arrested this month, including 5 presidential candidates. Ortega is widely expected to run for a 4th presidential term. Meanwhile, Mexico and Argentina have withdrawn their ambassadors to Nicaragua. The Biden administration also imposed new sanctions on 4 Nicaraguan officials and Ortega allies earlier this month. This is Jose Miguel Vivanco of Human Rights Watch.
Estamos pidiendo al secretario general Antonio Guterres.
We are asking Secretary General Antonio Guterres to go to the United Nations Security Council and report on the seriousness of what is happening in Nicaragua, not only around the abuses, the flagrant violations of fundamental rights and human rights, but also on the repercussions this may have for the region and from the point of view of the refugees who have had to flee Nicaragua.
In Mexico, at least 15 people were killed this weekend in the northern border city of Reynosa after a series of shootings. 4 4 suspected gunmen were also killed. The majority of victims are believed to be bystanders caught in the crossfire. Among the victims were taxi drivers, workers, and a nursing student. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has called for an investigation. Reynosa is located across the border from McAllen, Texas, and has been contested territory for drug cartels. On Tuesday, the state of Tamaulipas' top prosecutor blamed infighting between members of the Gulf Cartel for the weekend shooting. Tens of thousands of people have been killed or disappeared in Mexico amidst a years-long U.S.-backed war on drugs. The Committee to Protect Journalists says Israel must investigate last week's bombing of Arab-Israeli journalist Hassan Shaylan's home. Shaylan, who writes for Ynet, survived the attack. The group says it's at least the 3rd attack on an Arab-Israeli journalist in less than a month. The United States government has seized dozens of website domains linked to Iran, including state-owned PressTV.com, a popular English-language news site. They also shut down Yemeni and Iraqi channels. Journalist and news host Rania Khalek tweeted, quote, "If a country did this to U.S. media outlets, it would be seen as an act of war." In Hong Kong, news outlet Apple Daily says it's shutting down less than a week after authorities raided its newsroom, arresting editors and executives of the pro-democracy paper, and froze its accounts under the sweeping national security law. Meanwhile, the trial for the first person to be charged under the national security law started today. Tong Yin Kit was arrested last year after he collided with police officers while riding a motorbike and flying a flag with a popular protest slogan. In Spain, a group of Catalan separatist leaders have been released from prison a day after they were pardoned. In 2017, the Spanish central government cracked down on the separatists following an independence referendum and the Catalan parliament's declaration of independence. Some of the freed leaders will still face a ban on holding public office. Political leaders who fled Spain are not included in the pardon. This is Pere Aragonès, president of the government of Catalonia.
The decision taken today by the Spanish government is a recognition that the sentences were unjust. It is time for amnesty and the right to self-determination.
An international coalition of over 200 groups is calling on the Biden administration to permanently end the so-called global gag rule, which bars nonprofits in other countries from receiving U.S. funds if they provide abortions or even refer or counsel people on abortion. Biden rescinded the rule, but it remains at risk of being reinstated in future Republican administrations. The New York Times reports 4 of the Saudi men who participated in the abduction and murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 received State Department-approved paramilitary training in the U.S. The training was provided by the security company Tier 1 Group, which is owned by the private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management. In immigration news, the Biden administration will allow asylum seekers who were enrolled in Trump's Remain in Mexico program and ordered deported to their home countries to revive their asylum cases. Under Remain in Mexico, thousands of asylum seekers were forced to wait in often dangerous conditions in Mexico while their cases made their way through U.S. courts. BuzzFeed reports many of them were denied asylum because they couldn't make it to court because conditions were too dangerous to travel, while other asylum seekers never arrived to their court hearings in the U.S. because they were kidnapped by cartels, were ill, or denied entry because they were pregnant. This comes as immigrant justice advocates continue to denounce the Biden administration for expelling and turning away asylum seekers who recently arrived to the U.S.-Mexico border. As of June, the group Human Rights First has tracked more than 3,000 kidnappings and other attacks, including rape, human trafficking, and violent armed assaults against asylum seekers and migrants expelled at the U.S.-Mexico border since President Biden took office. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland announced Tuesday her agency will investigate the impact of government-run schools that sought to force the assimilation of indigenous children. The Interior Department, which oversaw the schools, will also seek to identify burial sites at the schools. Last month, the remains of 215 indigenous children were discovered at one such school in Canada. This is Secretary Haaland.
I come from ancestors who endured the horrors of Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead. The same agency that tried to eradicate our culture, our language, our spiritual practices, and our people. To address the intergenerational impact of Indian boarding schools and to promote spiritual and emotional healing in our communities, we must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past.
Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones says she will not join the faculty of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill next month without tenure. Hannah-Jones, creator of the 1619 Project, says, quote, political interference and influence led to the school board's decision to deny her tenure, which drew protest and sharp criticism from faculty, students, fellow academics, and some donors. And New Yorkers voted in its highly anticipated primary election Tuesday. In the heated mayoral race, Brooklyn Borough President, former New York police officer Eric Adams, is leading with over 31% of the vote. But it will likely take several weeks to announce a winner with the new ranked choice voting system. Civil rights attorney Maya Wiley is currently in second place with 22% of the vote, followed closely by former Sanitation Commissioner Catherine Garcia. 2020 presidential candidate Andrew Yang has conceded after receiving less than 12% of the tallied vote. Journalist Ross Barkan, who's written critically about Adams and other candidates, said he and other reporters were barred from Adams' election night party. Talk show host Curtis Sliwa has won the Republican nomination for New York City mayor. Meanwhile, in a stunning upset in Buffalo, New York, India Walton has claimed victory over four-term Mayor Byron Brown in the Democratic primary. Politico reports Walton is poised to become the first socialist mayor of a large U.S. city in 60 years. Walton will also be Buffalo's first woman mayor if she wins the general election in November. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, before we move on with the show and talk about the major block civil rights legislation in Washington, can you comment on what's happened so far, though we certainly don't know final results, in the first in the primary in New York for mayor?
Yes, Amy. Well, it does look that Eric Adams has a pretty substantial lead in this in the count. He's got about almost a 10% lead over Maya Wiley. But clearly, since New York is embarking on ranked choice voting for the first time in a mayoral election, there's still a long way to go here. Now there's going to be a process of tallying up the second, third, fourth, and fifth choices of voters. So it's going to take a while. I think the most interesting thing that's happened is, one, the almost complete collapse of Andrew Yang, who was considered and was covered by the press as a front runner for most of the time of this mayoral campaign. Eric Adams, as you noted, is a former police captain who was a reformer against police abuse within the department, but who has emerged as a more centrist candidate and focusing on how he not only his experience in government, but his ability to his willingness to tackle rising crime in the city. And another part of Adams is political viewpoints that hasn't gotten as much coverage. He's a big supporter of charter schools, and he got millions of dollars in support from many billionaires who are also charter school backers. So that remains to be seen how, if he does survive in the final count, what his policies will be toward the public school system. And I think interestingly, Adams is leading in all the outer boroughs of New York City, while Catherine Garcia, the former sanitation commissioner, won the majority of the votes in Manhattan, where obviously the biggest white portions of New York's population are. So this is it's going to be interesting to see. My sense is that Adams will probably prevail, but we don't know because we're in an uncharted territory when it comes to ranked choice voting now.
Just a few years ago, Adams had described himself as a conservative Republican.
Yes, but having known Eric Adams for many years, as I've mentioned before, I think his conservative republicanism was more a matter of convenience at that time, that he felt that he could get further within the Republican Party than in the Democratic Party, because most of his policies, I would not consider them to be what we consider today Republican policies.
Well, we will certainly continue to cover this closely watched race in New York City. When we come back, Senate Republicans have used the filibuster to block debate on the most sweeping voting rights bill considered by Congress in decades. We'll look at the For the People Act and the fight over the filibuster with Reverend William Barber and Elizabeth Heerer of the Brennan Center for Justice. Stay with us. Ego, covered by Frank Black. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York with Juan Gonzalez in New Jersey. Senate Republicans have used the filibuster to block debate on the most sweeping voting rights bill considered by Congress in decades. Every Democrat voted to open debate on the legislation, the For the People Act, but not a single Republican agreed to. For months, Senate Democrats have been trying to reform the filibuster, but they've fallen short due to opposition from two fellow Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. This all comes as Republican state lawmakers are passing sweeping measures to suppress the vote around the country. According to the Voting Rights Lab, 18 states have enacted more than 30 laws to restrict voting since the November election. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said Tuesday the fight to protect voting rights is not over.
Once again, Senate Republicans have signed their names in the ledger of history alongside Donald Trump, the big lie, and voter suppression, to their enduring disgrace. This vote, I'm ashamed to say, is further evidence that voter suppression has become part of the official platform of the Republican Party. Now, Republican senators may have prevented us from having a debate on voting rights today, but I want to be very clear about one thing. The fight to protect voting rights is not over, by no means. In the fight for voting rights, this vote was the starting gun, not the finish line.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell accused the Democrats of trying to stage a power grab by trying to pass the For the People Act.
Later today, the Senate will vote on whether to advance Democrats' transparently partisan plan to tilt every election in America permanently in their favor. By now, the rotten inner workings of this power grab have been thoroughly exposed to the light. We know that it would shatter a decades-old understanding that campaign finance law should have a bipartisan referee and turn the Federal Election Commission into a partisan majority cudgel for Democrats to wield against their political opponents.
We're joined now by two guests. Reverend William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. Today he's in Washington, D.C. for a moral march on Manchin and McConnell. And here in New York, Elizabeth Hira is with us, attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice's Democracy Program, former congressional staffer who helped to craft the original iteration of the For the People Act, lead author of a new report on the legislation titled Equity for the People. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! First, Elizabeth Hira, can you just exactly explain what happened? It actually wasn't a vote on the content of the For the People Act. This was a procedural vote. It was 50-50. Explain why Harris presides, the vice president, but doesn't vote, and why you need to get to 60 just to have a discussion.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy, and that's a great question to start us off with. I think that there was breathless reporting yesterday about how this was a stunning defeat that was the end of the bill, and that's actually not accurate. It's really important that people understand, as Leader Schumer said, this was only the beginning. Yesterday's vote was not a vote on the merits of the bill. It was a vote to open debate on the bill. So the practice is usually there's a debate, a discussion that you have to vote to have. And then the next thing that you do is actually vote on the content of the bill. So yesterday's vote was to open debate, and we had 50 Democrats united behind that decision. But the way that things work in the Senate, and what folks have heard a lot about, is the filibuster, where 60 votes are needed to sort of overcome a filibuster and proceed with debate. So all that yesterday indicates is that we did not have the 60 votes to start the debate, but it's actually only the first bite at the apple. And if you'll let me quickly explain, this might be a really good time to just explain that this fixation on getting 60 senators together misses a really important procedural point that should give a lot of people hope. You don't need 60 people to get together. There's wonderful procedural workaround in the Senate that is not formally changing the rules, but technically changing the rules, where you can get 50 senators together with the vice president as the tie-breaking vote. That's why, she was there presiding. 50 senators plus the vice president can choose to technically change the rules to defeat the filibuster, to sort of overcome that and say, hey, the 51 of us will change the rules. You no longer need 60. The 51 of us can decide to open debate on the bill. And at the minimum, America deserves that discussion. Yesterday's importance for everyone was to show Republicans were given an opportunity to say, hey, let's just discuss this. Free and fair, let's have an open discussion about this. They chose to not take that opportunity. That is not the end of the road. Democrats will have to figure out how to get together to, exactly as I said, take advantage of that procedural workaround. And the only thing that will make them do that is that they continue to hear from the people that this is a critical priority.
But I'd like to ask you, Ms. Hira, about the actual content of the bill. Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion that this is a sweeping bill, but there's been very little public information about the specific provisions of the bill. And it is pretty sweeping. There are not only Election Day, a holiday for the first time in the United States. Many other countries already have that, obviously. But there are all kinds of changes to the enfranchisement of felons who have completed their terms across the country. There are the 2 weeks of early voting nationwide. There's also a requirement for super PACs to disclose their donors. Could you talk about many of the separate provisions that the Republicans essentially see this as passing this bill would doom them for decades to come?
Yeah, so exactly as you say, Juan, thank you for the question. The bill is, I think of it as a massive democracy reform package that makes sense because it comprehensively fixes so many things that are wrong in our democracy. So many of us were watching the 2020 elections and saying, how is that happening in 2020? This bill creates a wholesale opportunity for us to fix all of the things that have been wrong in our democracy. So as you mentioned, it would include automatic voter registration, where voters, when they go to the DMV, can just get asked the question, hey, do you want to register to vote? And if you opt out, then you don't have to. But if you opt in, we have the potential to bring tens of millions of Americans onto the rolls through that sort of process. Another important reform, same-day voter registration, which we actually know is one of the single most effective interventions to bring young people onto the rolls. Young people are currently Gen Z and Gen Y together, are the largest bloc in the electorate. They actually surpass the boomers, who are only 28%. But they are not registered to vote at the same rates. Same-day registration is actually an intervention that would bring so many of them, again, the most diverse cohort in America, onto the voter rolls. And again, these have been tried. Nothing here is revolutionary. This has actually been tried in states all across the country, All H.R. 1S1 does is set a minimum federal standard so that states have to abide at a minimum with what folks need to be able to vote, need to have to be able to vote freely and fairly. So same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, democracy restoration, so many places, 29 states in America, restrict your franchise to vote even after you've returned to your community. And we know because of mass incarceration, people of color are deeply overrepresented in those numbers. So democracy restoration will bring 3.9 million people onto the rolls. 3.9 million, I think 1.6 of them are people of color. And voter ID, people have been saying that the bill bans voter ID. It absolutely does not. We know that communities of color, women, transgender people significantly lack access to identities or identification that reflects their identity and their legal name. This would provide a workaround so you can make a sworn statement affirming your identity so that you don't lose your right to vote because a poll worker doesn't think that you look how you should look for your ID. And to your point, it's also not just voting rights. I know folks have been focused on voting rights because, as Amy mentioned at the top, there's been this sweeping wave of voter suppressive efforts, not only the bills that have passed, but in 48 states, the Brennan Center has found that 389 bills have been offered to suppress the right to vote. So in addition to that incredible work to sort of bring people onto the rolls, this bill also asks a really important civil rights question, which is just what infrastructurally could we change in America to change the fact that the government does not reflect the people? And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to get into it a little bit more. But I think the quick version of that reflection that I always give is that the 117th Congress, the current Congress, is the most diverse in American history, which is fantastic, except that Congress is 77% white. It is 73% male. Fewer than 5% of people in the last Congress reported ever having worked a blue-collar job. And, my fun fact that I hope people will share is that women in the House of Representatives only got their own bathroom on the House floor in 2011. Prior to that, they had to walk out to get their own votes. These structures were not designed to include all of America, and that's the history of exclusion is discussed in this paper that you just flagged from the Brennan Center. But this bill is an opportunity through campaign finance reform that discloses big money, that creates a small dollar public financing system that is voluntary, funded by the people to get billionaires out of elections. It's sort of revolutionary in its ability to take all these really common sense things and fix them up, in addition to a package that says, hey, voters should be in line for only 30 minutes. So I could spend all day talking about it, but I really recommend that you look at the Brennan Center resources that very clearly lay out the content and, frankly, the import of this bill at this moment in history.
And I'd like to bring Reverend William Barber into the conversation. Welcome once again back to Democracy Now! And Reverend, your reaction to what transpired yesterday in the Senate and what needs to be done for those who want voting rights reform.
Thank you so much to both you and Amy. And let me just say, what my sister just did is what Democrats ought to be doing. They ought to be laying out this bill, not just saying things like we're fighting Jim Crow. It's not Jim Crow specific, it's James Crow Esquire, because this attack on this bill is trying to address what's happening to all people. And what the Republicans are doing in a real sense is being against all people. And what she just did is what they should be doing, what should have been done before we got to the debates, laying out the scope of this bill. Now, yesterday, all we saw is what we already knew. McConnell and his Republican cohorts are just mean, politically mean, and they are committed to keeping alive voter suppression that started with the Southern strategy. They are today Strom Thurmond. So we already knew that. We knew that last year when we saw them more willing to take a Supreme Court seat and keep people out of caskets because they wouldn't pass COVID relief, but they would rush through a way to replace a Supreme Court seat. So we already knew that. But the other side of this is we have to say this. I appreciate the leader saying that it shows where Republicans are, but as a moral leader, to just speak truth, we also got to talk about Manchin and Sinema, but really Manchin, because he's part of the problem. And that mindset, this so-called moderate Democrat, there's just no such thing as you will protect the right to vote moderately. You will assure domestic tranquility moderately. You will establish justice moderately. This could have been over and done with. The Democrats could have gone to as my sister mentioned, the 50, the vice president could have given a deciding vote. And at some point, if you're saying this is the thing, that keeps the democracy from falling. This is the moment. The other people are totally committed to voter suppression. You know you can't compromise with them because they don't even believe there's a problem. So if this is the thing, then you must act with the power that you have, the power you were given. And how we've never, Manchin now wants this compromise. This sets up a possibility of that bill replacing the John Lewis bill, because he wrote the bill, and that would be a travesty if we start arguing on the Manchin compromise. We've never had photo ID. He wants that. We're in court fighting right now and winning. I come from a state where we beat a voter ID. And why does a senator from West Virginia, where 79% of his people want the full vote on this bill and VRA, 81% of Democrats, why does he get to put a compromise forward that weakens? One thing is he wanted to compromise from, say, 20 early voting days to 15, but that's not what we're talking about. He wants to weaken the ability of the Attorney General to enforce preclearance. There's nothing in his compromise about addressing felony disenfranchisement. What we should have right now is the best voting rights lawyers vet the impact of the compromise, put it aside, and Democrats need to use their power. Listen, Republicans went to majority votes for Supreme Court nominees for lifetime appointment. This is about the life of this democracy. We need to go ahead and pass this bill, end the filibuster. They have the power to do it, and pass this bill. Lastly, in state houses across this country, some of the poorest states, the reddest states, they are passing voter suppression laws. But this is the connection we also have to make. The same people that are pushing voter suppression laws to deny and abridge the right to vote are also against expanding health care, against living wages. They are against a true infrastructure bill. They are against climate change. You have to connect the two. The voter suppression also suppresses us moving forward on the things that would lift all Americans. And truth of the matter is, Manchin ought to be ashamed of himself for coming from a state, the mountaineer state. And that's why today people are coming from West Virginia and Kentucky. We marched on his office a week ago to say to McConnell and Manchin, it's time out now. We wish McConnell would change. He probably won't. But Manchin and those others need to quit this foolishness. We shouldn't be going through this for another 3 and 4 months. This is a tool. Voter suppression is a tool of the committed racists and the greedy aristocracy to undermine the votes of the people. It's not just a black thing. It is, in fact, the way in which the powers like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce wield power by promoting and supporting those persons in the political system that would suppress the vote. Let me read, lastly, something Dr. King said. The threat of the free exercise of the ballot by the Negro and white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. That's what happened when the Negro and white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society, a society of care for all people. This is not just a black thing. This is a fear of the American people, a fear of black and white and brown and Asian and Native people coming together and pushing this nation forward. And we need to quit all of this political gamesmanship. If this is the moment that our democracy is threatened, then act like it. Vote to end this filibuster. Vote and give the vice president the power to cast that one vote to pass these bills, VRA and this bill, and then do living wages while you're doing it too, and the George Floyd bill and infrastructure. And let's do it, and then let the voters decide next year at the polls whether or not they like the direction of the country.
Let's go to a clip of the Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock speaking on the Senate floor about the importance of the For the People Act.
Let's not kid ourselves. In this chamber of all places, a few months after January 6th, this is dangerous stuff. And that's one reason we need to debate the legislation before us. I'm hoping to include a provision I introduced yesterday with some of my colleagues that will prevent politicians from being able to overrule local election officials and therefore subvert the voices of the people. This provision will also protect local election volunteers from harassment and intimidation. Right now across the nation, constitutional rights are being assaulted, and I fear that if we don't act as a body in this moment, we will have crossed a dangerous Rubicon in our nation that will make it extremely difficult for the next generation to secure voting rights for every eligible American.
That's Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock. The Secretary of State there has knocked another 100,000 voters off the voter rolls in Georgia. Senator Raphael Warnock will have to run again in 2022. Elizabeth Hira, Senator Warnock talked about what's happening to local election officials, and the Brennan Center has done several reports, one on the number of election officials around the country who are terrified right now, who fear for their lives, who've been threatened, many who are quitting. Can you talk about that?
So this is my colleagues at the Brennan Center have put together this phenomenal report based on direct work with election officials who are getting death threats in their homes, threats against their family, threats against their safety. And this is driven by the big lie about voter fraud, which many of us know about, that people have been driven into hysteria by misinformation and disinformation, led to believe that their votes don't count. And this comes back to what Reverend Barber was saying. The big lie is a dog whistle, and in some cases just straight up racism, where people are being told that some Americans' votes don't count as much as others. And our election officials are bearing the brunt of that. And that is, again, like we were talking about, the beauty of the For the People Act is that it provides support, it provides financial support to election administrators so they can get their job done. But it deals with that big picture question. Through the support infrastructurally provided in the For the People Act, we can trust and have confidence in our elections. There is money for paper ballots. There is support for just letting people know that their elections are being run efficiently, this should just be sort of an administrative effort by states so that people can get their votes counted. And I want to follow up just on this other point that was made earlier.
Just before you do, I want to play some of the election officials who spoke to the Brennan Center.
There were people who showed up outside of election officials' houses, armed, people that showed up outside of offices, threatening phone calls, harassment.
And online discussions about types of ammunition and guns to use on me.
It became a daily occurrence outside of our facility to have anywhere from 50 to 150 individuals outside. Some of them were armed.
There was a fence sort of separating the building from the protesters. And they were armed.
I was walking up the street to the park. This big Caucasian guy came up to me out of his car and he said, "I've been waiting for you, Miss Winfrey. I want to know why you cheated during the election. I want to know why Donald Trump lost. It's your fault."
So that is scary, those voices of election officials put together by the Brennan Center. Elizabeth Hira, if you could then make that other point.
Well, yes, I think this is all actually it's at the same point. What you are seeing manifested there is a disbelief about the possibility that the American vote could be safe because there are fissures in America being, frankly, amplified by hostile forces like Reverend Barber was talking about. There are people who do not want the American democratic experiment to be succeeding. And that democratic experiment is recognizing that every person, no matter how much they have been marginalized in American history, is actually a part of the American polity. And they have a seat here and they have a place here. Their vote matters. And more importantly, they should have a seat at the table. Only when you undermine that vision do you get people saying, hey, you will not replace us, right? You get these frightening messages that are causing people to lash out against the public servants who, frankly, are being underpaid to do the work that they need to do to keep our infrastructure together. So that brings me to this point that I wanted to raise, that Reverend Barber was talking about these pieces of the bill that we are having to watch sort of negotiate away. The great news about the fact that yesterday was only the beginning and not the finish line is that the people speaking has been able to change the structure of this bill, and it's been able to change who has supported this bill. So anybody who's worked in Washington knows that 2 weeks is an eternity in Washington. And 2 weeks ago, people were tripping over themselves to announce that Joe Manchin had said this bill was completely dead and would go nowhere. And all of us know yesterday, Mr. Manchin was right at the negotiating table with Democrats after having been rejected by Republicans for his compromise bill. What is in this bill is still very much open season, and it's the stuff that Senator Warnock was talking about, changes that can still be made, and protecting all the critical provisions that Reverend Barber raised. only with the clamor of the people continuing over the summer, leading up into the critical fight for redistricting, right? This bill affects not only who can vote and who can run, but how our congressional maps get drawn, so how the people get represented is also at stake. And so I actually think it's really important to come back to the meta point. Election officials are being attacked because we're being told our elections are not working and our democracy is not working. H.R. 1 will fill a gap to let people know the infrastructure is safe, it is sound, it is supported, and everybody is welcome here. No matter the color of your skin, your gender identity, your gender, you are welcome here. Your disability status, all of that is supported in this bill by making big infrastructural changes to let every American in. And the critical point of that is it doesn't matter for its own sake. It matters because it lets Americans get to the work that we actually need to do. Washington's focus on political infighting that, frankly, everyday citizens can't afford to care about. Exactly as Reverend Barber said, we have people in food pantry lines. We have an economy that has a K-curve where the worst off are doing worse and the best off are doing better. We have basic problems in education and healthcare.
Elizabeth, if I can, I'd like to bring in Reverend Barber. I wanted to ask him if he has any further comments, but also if you could talk a little bit about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is likely to come to the Senate floor later this year. Your thoughts about whether this legislation will fare any better than what's happened so far with the For the People Act?
Well, it will if we don't have gamesmanship among the Democrats. Now, if you have power, you hold more responsibility than the people that are in the majority. So I'm hoping that this is not a gamesmanship. Now, we also heard from the Senate Majority Leader that he got Manchin to the table with an agreement to bring his compromise bill up with the things that actually take away much of what my sister was talking about. We can't have that. I mean, you think about, there's nothing in that compromise bill about modernizing the voting systems. This is nothing about the felony disenfranchisement, but you want to replace that with something we've never had nationwide, which is a form of voter ID. Listen, you cannot say something is dangerous. As my dear friend Senator Ron said, we're at a dangerous point, and then you say, oh, I see you drowning, but let's have another compromise. Let's have another debate. The power is with the Democrats. And that's why we're marching today and we'll continue. And what we're saying is we need street moral heat, nonviolent. We don't need an insurrection, violent insurrection. We need direct action nonviolently. We need to get in the streets and march on these senators, Democrat and Republican in that state. Need to come to D.C. We're going to launch that today because this is the moment. And we can't afford to see something compromised away. You know, the Voting Rights Act was compromised. That's why we still have some of the fights we have today. The Civil Rights Act was compromised in '64. We've had too much of that. Some things are non-negotiable. The 15th Amendment says nobody, no state, no entity has the right to deny or abridge. And all of the things that McConnell and them want to do is an abridgment of the right, which means it's violating the Constitution. So this should be easy. This should be an easy, we've done this, we've talked. You all want to use this coward political filibuster that's really nothing but interposition, nullification. We're going to 50 and we're going to go to the 1. You can debate then when we bring it to the floor. We'll add the amendments. We're going to do 50 and 1, and you can come over if you want to. Listen, they can still come on over, but if not, they have to understand they're not going to shut down this. And we, the people, have to now move in the streets. This is not just emailing and texting time. That's why we're marching today, and we will continue. And I want to say one other thing. We've got to lift this up for everybody. It can't just be, as I said, a black issue, black versus white. Republicans actually want that. No, this is the denial of this bill hurts everybody. And lastly, you know, I don't know him to talk about stuff like this, but this is how dangerous some of what Manchin is doing is by lingering and keeping this out there and negotiating. When we went to West Virginia, I got a threat. Very, very serious one, said, if you keep marching, we will kill you. You know, when you keep this stuff out here like this, instead of just dealing with it, just go ahead and deal with it and move on. That's what Republicans do. They don't wait around. They will deal with their wrong. They will vote on wrong and move on. Democrats need to move on. All of this playing around, Manchin might change party. He's not going to change party. You know, he's not going to do that. But we need to get this done. and it can get done. And we're going to call on him to be a true mountaineer. West Virginian mountaineers are always free. Sinema, none of these, she needs to move. Not one of them, not one Democrat said during the election, if you elect me, I'm going to stand against the For the People Act. I'm going to compromise it away, you know. And by the way, the For the People Act is the John Lewis bill. The Voting Rights Act, they put his name on it, but the For the People Act is the John Lewis bill. He wrote that bill. That's his dream, written in his blood, written in the blood of all the martyrs. So if you really want to pass the John Lewis bill, you pass the For the People's Act. The Voting Rights Act was already passed years ago. We just need to restore pre-clearance that was knocked out by 5 members of the Supreme Court 8 years ago. And McConnell, Manchin, all of them, they've had 8 years since 2013 to fix this. So we need to do this and do this now, and it needs to happen. But we don't need it just to keep lingering and playing games and begging folk. We need to push out. And we're going to say to Manchin, mountaineers are supposed to always be free. Even Robert Byrd, when he changed from being a suppressionist and a racist to being about the Constitution and justice, he came up with ways. He didn't even like this kind, Senator Robert didn't even like this kind of filibustering because it's a cowardly thing. You don't have to stay on the floor. You don't have to debate. All you have to do is say you don't have 60. So honor the legacy of Senator Byrd and Mother Jones, who said, pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Do what's right. That's what has to be said. That's why we're coming. And people are willing to even put their bodies on the line. But we need a season now of nonviolent action all across this country and in states. And we're going to try to signal that on today. People just need to begin and say, now is the time that we keep this democracy from spiraling downward to something that is other than the promise that has been made to us. This is the moment that we either breathe life and resuscitate this democracy, or we continue to snuff it out. And when you're in crisis, the last thing you need somebody doing is standing over you saying, well, I wonder, are we going to help them? Let's debate a compromise. There should be no compromise when it comes to protecting the right to a vote from being denied or abridged.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, I want to thank you so much for being with us, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. He is speaking to us from Washington, D.C., where he is leading a moral march on Manchin and McConnell today. And Elizabeth Hira, joining us from New York, with the Brennan Center for Justice, lead author of their report, Equity for the People, S1, HR1, and the Fight for an Inclusive Democracy. We will link to that report. Next up, the White House says it'll miss its goal of getting 70% of adults at least partially vaccinated by July 4th, alarming public health officials as the COVID Delta variant rapidly spreads. We will talk with an epidemiologist about what this means. Stay with us. Disparate Youth by Santa Gold. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we turn now to the coronavirus, we look at growing concerns that the highly contagious Delta variant could cause new surges of COVID-19 here in the United States and worldwide. White House coronavirus advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci issued this warning Tuesday.
We are not done until we completely crush this outbreak. The Delta variant is currently the greatest threat in the U.S. to our attempt to eliminate COVID-19. Good news, our vaccines are effective against the Delta variant. Conclusion, we have the tools, so let's use them and crush the outbreak.
This comes as the White House says it'll miss its goal of getting 70% of adults at least partially vaccinated by July 4th. Vaccinations are available for anyone ages 12 and up in the United States, but just 45% of Americans are fully vaccinated. Only 16 states have fully vaccinated more than half of their populations. Earlier this week, the World Health Organization warned the Delta variant's fast becoming the dominant source of new COVID-19 cases globally. For more, we're joined by Dr. Ali Khan, epidemiologist and Dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's the former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response and the author of The Next Pandemic: On the Front Lines Against Humankind's Gravest Dangers. Dr. Khan, welcome back to Democracy Now! So explain what the Delta variant is and why it is so significant when it comes to low number of vaccinations throughout the South and in states like Utah and Missouri.
Thank you, Amy. Always a pleasure to chat with you. So before talking about the Delta variant, let's actually talk about a little bit about the good news. 150 million Americans that have been fully vaccinated here in the United States. And after a 2-week pause, a stall of cases, we're slowly seeing cases come back down again in the United States. Now, unfortunately, there are multiple states that have not been very aggressive in vaccinating people. And what we're seeing now is cases, small outbreaks in areas where there have not been good vaccination. The Delta variant. So the virus mutates all the time, and it has multiple different types of variants. Sometimes those variants become variants of concern because they're more infectious, more deadly, or don't respond to our treatments very well. And Delta is one of those variants. When we had this conversation 2-3 months ago, we were talking about the Alpha variant, which quickly, within 8 weeks, became the dominant variant in the United States. And now this Delta variant is 60% more infectious than the Alpha variant, definitely looks like more severe disease. And while vaccine is very effective for severe disease, it's not as effective for mild disease. And this variant went from, I think, like 2.7% on May 22nd to now estimates are 20 to 30% currently. So in essentially less than a month. So our expectation should be by July, this will be the dominant variant.
And Dr. Khan, I wanted to ask you about the broader picture, the worldwide picture now with South America now being the epicenter of the COVID pandemic throughout the world. 5% of the world's population, I think more than 25% of the cases. And also the fact that some countries that already have higher vaccination rates than those in the United States are still seeing surges in cases, largely because those countries have received the Chinese virus. Countries like Chile, Bahrain, Mongolia, which have up to 68% of their populations fully vaccinated, yet they're seeing surges in cases.
Thank you, Juan, for that question. So it's actually 2 questions and maybe 3. So let's do the first part. So while we had great news about vaccination here in the United States and in many other countries, that's not true worldwide. So worldwide, there's only been about 2.7 billion vaccines administered, and that's 17% of the global population. So there's a long way to go in vaccinating the rest of the world. And that inequity is showing up in lots of cases, and mainly, as you mentioned, in South America. So South America has 7 of the 10 countries with the most cases are in South America. There's also a second piece to that, which is that undoubtedly a number of countries that chose Chinese vaccines, the Sinovac vaccine, the Sinopharma vaccine, despite very high coverages, actually coverages as high as Israel, they're seeing a lot of cases. Now, it's not just probably because the vaccine doesn't work. It has to do with, how fast they opened up. but there is real concern that these vaccines may not be very effective. And I think it's really important for those countries to continue to test how effective those vaccines are and not have a false sense of security because they have these high vaccine rates to think we're fine, because they're absolutely not fine.
The World Health Organization said Monday it's setting up a hub in South Africa to help poorer countries. Can you talk about the role the U.S. should be playing, poor and middle-income countries producing their own COVID-19 vaccines using the mRNA technology behind the world's most effective shots?
So the U.S. has been playing a leadership role both from a multilateral standpoint and a bilateral standpoint. So President Biden's recent announcement of giving 500 million doses worldwide to the multilateral effort led by WHO pretty much puts the U.S. in the lead compared to any country in the world. So the U.S. has been showing dramatic leadership on a global stage in getting countries vaccinated. And then bilaterally, for example, Taiwan just got 2.5 million or something vaccines from the U.S. Recently. So bilaterally, the U.S. is also supporting countries based on their political alignments. We are also the U.S. is also supporting India and other countries, but I think there's always more that can be done to help support local production of vaccines. And how can we support that with sort of patent issues to allow these vaccines to be made elsewhere and the know-how to do it? Because let's be honest, 40 million doses a day is going to take us years to vaccinate the world. And given how these variants keep popping up, unless we get cases down across the world, we're at risk of just another variant coming into the United States and restarting our outbreak, and potentially a more deadly variant that doesn't respond to our vaccines.
And Dr. Khan, I'm wondering your advice on a question that many doctors are receiving now in terms of people with very young children, infants, toddlers, who are not yet eligible for any vaccine, the issue of returning to school in the fall, how their caregivers should be dealing with the children. Your advice?
So my advice is that we have lots of experience now globally and in the United States on how we can get our kids back in school safely. And the number one way to do that is make sure we all get vaccinated. So every adult, every individual 12 and older can get vaccinated. And when you get cases so low in the community, our younger kids between 5 and 12 will not be at risk. So that's the secret. Everybody who is eligible to get vaccinated needs to get out there and get vaccinated.
Now, Dr. Rochelle Walensky addressed this issue yesterday, a few days ago, about I guess there's about 300 reported cases of myocarditis, of inflammation of the heart among very young children. What is your concern about this?
Today, following up on Dr. Walensky's comments, the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, which is an independent group that advises CDC and the United States on how to use vaccines, will be reviewing these 800 reports to see whether or not they believe there's a link to the vaccine, and then what advice they need to give Americans. So they'll compare it to how often this usually occurs, how often it occurs with the vaccine, what the risk of the disease is, and how to protect kids. I think the good news has been that these cases have pretty much been very mild, but I'm looking forward to see the data today so that we can make a more informed judgment about continuing to vaccinate kids, especially potentially kids less than 12 years of age.
And we just have 10 seconds, but there's now this discussion of booster shots after 8 months or a year in the United States, when so many countries in the world don't even have access to any vaccines. Your comment?
I think it's premature to talk about booster shots until we truly know what the duration of the immunity is in the United States. And we may potentially get cases down so low that just routine public health measures could take care of it. So a little premature to talk about booster shots.
Well, Dr. Ali Khan, we want to thank you so much for being with us, epidemiologist and dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, author of The Next Pandemic: On the Front Lines Against Humankind's Gravest Dangers. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.